The sky over the plains was the color of a fresh bruise, a sullen purple-gray that promised no rain, only a choking dust that would settle in the lungs and on the heart. It was a fitting sky for a wedding, Clara thought, or at least for her wedding. She stood beside Silas Horn at the foot of a makeshift altar outside the town's half-built church, the raw pine of the cross smelling sharp and clean in the otherwise stale air. The smell was the only clean thing about the day. Clara felt a profound numbness, a cold weight that had settled deep in her bones, leaving her limbs heavy and her mind strangely vacant. She was 17. The man whose thick, calloused hand rested on the small of her back was more than twice her age. His hair a salt and pepper gray, his face a roadmap of hard lines carved by the sun and a stern disposition. Silas Horn owned the largest ranch in the county, a fact that was whispered among the small gathering of townspeople with a mixture of awe and resentment. He was a man of substance, a man of power, and now he was to be her husband. She did not look at the faces in the small crowd. She didn't need to. She could feel their judgment like the gritty wind on her cheeks. Some of the women, their face pinched with pity, saw her as a lamb to the slaughter, a poor girl sacrificed for her family's survival. Others, particularly the mothers of unmarried daughters, looked on with a tight-lipped scorn. They saw a greedy girl, a sinner who would sell her soul for the comfort of a wealthy man's roof, never mind the coldness of his bed. Clara knew the truth was somewhere in the sorrowful space between the two, a truth too heavy and too shameful to name. She was neither a martyr nor a harlot. She was simply out of choices. The preacher, a gaunt man whose voice was as dry as the cracked earth beneath their feet, droned on about duty and providence. His words were scattered by the wind, which moaned a low, mournful tune as it swept across the vast, unforgiving landscape. This was a land that broke things. It broke wagons, it broke plows, it broke the spirit of men and women who came west with dreams of gold and green pastures. The earth was a hard pan of sun-baked clay, split with fissures that looked like gaping wounds. In the distance, the jagged peaks of the mountains stood like silent, stone-faced witnesses, their gaze ancient and indifferent to the small, desperate dramas playing out below. The world felt immense and empty, and Clara felt herself shrinking within it, becoming as small and silent as a stone. When the preacher said, "You may kiss the bride," Silas turned to her. His eyes were the color of faded denim, and they held no warmth, only a flat, possessive light. He did not lean in with affection. It was a claiming, a pressing of his dry, chapped lips against hers, a gesture that was less a kiss and more the sealing of a deed. The smell of tobacco and sweat clung to him, and she had to fight the urge to recoil. A smattering of polite applause followed, thin and pathetic against the vast silence of the plains. She was Mrs. Horn now. The name felt like a shroud. The wedding night was not a celebration of union, but a lesson in ownership. The Horn ranch house was large but sparsely furnished, filled with a masculine austerity that offered no comfort. There were no soft edges, no feminine touches. It was a fortress built against the harshness of the land, and it felt just as cold inside as out. In their bedroom, a single lamp cast long, dancing shadows on the walls. Silas watched her as she stood hesitantly by the bed, his expression unreadable. He did not speak of love or tenderness, or even of partnership. He spoke of duty. "You belong to me now, Clara," he said, his voice low and gravelly. He began to unbutton his shirt, his movements slow and deliberate. "This house, this land, it is all mine, and so are you. Do you understand?" She could only nod, a knot of ice forming in her stomach. He saw the tremor in her hands as she reached for the buttons on her simple wedding dress. "Fear is a kind of weakness," he stated, not unkindly, but as a simple matter of fact, like a man observing the weather. "And love is a greater weakness still. It makes people soft. It makes them foolish. We have no room for such things here. There is only work and survival and obedience. He approached her then, and his touch was not gentle. It was the touch of a man assessing livestock, a firm, proprietary grip that spoke of possession, not passion. He treated her body as a piece of property he had just acquired, an object to be used for its intended purpose. The act itself was swift and methodical, a cold and mechanical transaction that left her feeling hollowed out. Her spirit bruised more deeply than her flesh. As he rolled away from her and settled into a heavy sleep, Clara lay awake, staring into the oppressive darkness. He had taken her body, but it was her soul that felt stolen. "Love is weakness," he had said. In that moment, she believed him. The only thing she felt was a profound, aching shame, a stain that she feared would never wash away. The full weight of that shame settled upon her the next morning. Silas was already gone when she awoke, the other side of the bed cold. She dressed in the gray light of dawn and made her way to the kitchen, where Silas sat at the head of a long wooden table, drinking coffee. He gestured for her to sit, his eyes lingering on her for a moment before he spoke. "Your father is a fool," he said bluntly, setting his cup down with a sharp click. "But he knows how to settle a debt. He owed me a considerable sum, enough to have cost him his farm, his tools, everything." Clara stared at him, the meaning of his words slowly dawning on her, each one a separate blow. She had known her father was in trouble, had seen the worry etched on his face for months, but she had not known the extent of it. "He offered me a deal," Silas continued, his voice devoid of any emotion. "His debt, forgiven in its entirety. In exchange for you." The room seemed to tilt. So this was it. Not a marriage for survival, not a choice made from desperation. It was a trade. She had been sold like a head of cattle, her worth calculated against a column of figures in a ledger. The shame she had felt the night before curdled into something colder and more bitter. It was the icy finality of powerlessness. Her life was not her own. It had been bartered away by the one man who should have protected her. She felt a wave of nausea and gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white. Silas watched her reaction with a detached curiosity. "Do not look so grim. Girl, you have a roof over your head and food in your belly. Many women would call that a blessing. Just remember your place. You are here to run this house and to give me sons. Do that, and we will have no trouble." He stood then, scraping his chair back, and placed his hat on his head. "I have work to do." He left without another word, leaving Clara alone in the silent kitchen with the full, crushing weight of her new reality. A week passed in a blur of lonely, monotonous work. Clara learned the rhythms of the ranch, the endless cycle of chores that began before sunrise and ended long after dark. She cooked, she cleaned, she mended, moving through the large, empty house like a ghost. Silas was a constant, formidable presence, but he was not a companion. He spoke to her only to give orders or to find fault in her work. The silence between them was a heavy, suffocating thing, broken only by the howling of the wind outside. Her loneliness became a physical ache, a constant companion that sat in her chest like a stone. It was on a blistering hot afternoon, a little over a week after her wedding, that she saw him for the first time. A cattle drive was passing by the southern edge of the Horn property, a long, snaking river of dust and hide moving slowly toward the distant railhead. The air was thick with the lowing of the cattle and the sharp yells of the cowboys. Clara had taken a bucket of water out to the small vegetable garden she was attempting to coax from the unforgiving soil, mostly as an excuse to be out of the house, to feel the sun on her skin, even if it was a punishing, relentless heat. She stood by the fence, watching the procession, her eyes scanning the riders. They were a rough-looking collection of men, their faces caked with dust, their bodies lean and wiry from long days in the saddle. And then she saw him. He was set apart from the others, riding not with them, but slightly behind, a lone figure moving with a quiet, efficient grace. He was younger than most of the others, though it was hard to tell for certain. A wide-brimmed hat cast his face in shadow, but she could see he was lean-jawed, his shoulders broad beneath a dusty shirt. What held her attention was a long, jagged scar that cut down from his left temple, disappearing into the collar of his shirt. It was an old wound, silvery white against his sun-darkened skin, a mark of some past violence that set him apart. As if feeling her gaze, he lifted his head. For a single, suspended moment, their eyes met across the dusty expanse. His eyes were not blue like Silas's, but a deep, startling brown, the color of wet earth after a rain. In their depths, she saw something that made her breath catch in her throat. It was not pity, or curiosity, or lust. It was a profound and weary sadness, a quiet brokenness that she recognized instantly, for it was a mirror to the desolation in her own soul. It was a look that said, "I see you, not as a wife or a woman, but as a fellow prisoner in a world of pain." The moment was shattered as quickly as it began. A steer broke from the herd, and he spurred his horse, turning away to head it off with an easy, practiced skill. But the connection lingered, a strange, unspoken current that had passed between them. It was an ache, a question mark hanging in the shimmering heat. For the first time since she had arrived at the ranch, Clara felt something other than numbness or shame. It was a flicker of something, a feeling she could not name, but it was enough to make her heart beat a little faster. She learned his name was Eli. He was a hired hand, taken on by Silas to help with the branding and the summer work. He was quiet, almost unnervously so. He rarely spoke to the other hands, preferring to take his meals alone by the bunkhouse, staring out at the darkening plains. Rumors trailed him like his own shadow. The other cowboys whispered about him when they thought he couldn't hear. They said he had been a soldier in the war, that he'd seen things that had changed him. One story, told in hushed tones, claimed he had once shot a man in cold blood over a card game in a town down south. No one knew if it was true, but it was a story that fit him, a story that explained the haunted look in his eyes and the way he held himself apart from the world. He was a man with a past that was written on his face in the form of that long, pale scar. Clara's loneliness, already a vast and barren landscape, now had a single point of focus. The unbearable weight of her existence seemed to lessen, just slightly. Whenever she caught a glimpse of him, she began to invent reasons to be outside when the men were working. She would carry a bucket of fresh water to the corrals, her heart pounding in her chest, hoping for just a glance. She'd find a stretch of fence near where he was working that suddenly needed mending, her fingers fumbling with the wire as she watched him from the corner of her eye. He never approached her. He never spoke a word, but he was aware of her. She could feel it, sometimes, as she walked back to the house. She would feel his eyes on her back. When she brought the water, he would wait until she was gone before approaching the bucket, but not before giving her a slow, deliberate nod of his head. A gesture so small it was almost invisible, yet it felt as significant as a shout. The tension between them began to build, a silent, fragile thing woven from stolen glances and unspoken thoughts. It was a dangerous game in a place where a woman's reputation was as brittle as sun-scorched grass, and her husband's jealousy was a coiled snake. But for Clara, those fleeting moments were a lifeline. They were a secret she kept tucked away in the desolate corners of her heart, a tiny rebellion against the crushing reality of her life. Beneath the burning, indifferent sun, amidst the dust and the sweat and the silence, something was taking root. It was a fragile, nameless thing, born not of hope, but of a shared, silent understanding of what it meant to be broken. The silent language of glances and gestures continued for weeks. A fragile thread spun between them in the harsh, open air of the ranch. Clara began to see Eli not just as a figure of quiet sorrow, but as a source of small, almost imperceptible kindnesses. She was scrubbing clothes by the back porch one morning when Silas stormed out of the house, his face a thundercloud. He kicked the empty water bucket beside her, the metal clanging against the wooden steps. "This pump handle is loose again," he snarled, his voice a low growl of pure irritation. "A man can't get a decent drink of water in his own home. Fix it." He didn't wait for a reply, simply turned and strode toward the stables, his anger radiating like heat from a forge. Clara's shoulders slumped. She knew nothing of fixing pumps. She knew only that his fury would be worse when she failed. She spent an hour wrestling with the heavy iron, her hands raw and streaked with grease, but the handle only wobbled more precariously. Defeated, she went inside to start on dinner, the dread of Silas's return a cold knot in her stomach. The next morning, when she went to fetch water, the handle was firm and steady. It moved with a smooth, silent ease it hadn't possessed before. There was no sign of who had done it, but she knew. It was a silent message, a repair made in secret, a kindness offered from the shadows. Another time, Silas found fault with the way she had stacked firewood, claiming it was unstable and an eyesore. His voice rose with every word, a whip of verbal scorn that cut at her in the open yard. "Are you simple, girl? Can you not even perform a task a child could manage?" The other ranch hands averted their eyes, pretending to be busy with their work, leaving her to stand alone in the circle of his rage. Suddenly, Eli appeared, leading a horse from the corral. He didn't look at Clara, keeping his eyes on Silas. "Sorry to interrupt, Mr. Horn," he said, his voice calm and even. "But that new mare threw a shoe. I'll need your say on whether to send for the farrier or try to fix it myself." The interruption was perfectly timed, a deliberate diversion. It drew Silas's attention, his anger shifting from his wife to the more pressing, practical matter of his livestock. The storm of his temper passed, and Clara was left standing by the woodpile, trembling slightly, her heart filled with a silent, aching gratitude for the man who had shielded her without ever looking her in the eye. The most potent moment came on a muddy afternoon after a brief, violent shower had turned the yard into a slick of red clay. Carrying a heavy basket of wet laundry, her foot slipped. She went down hard, the basket tumbling, scattering clean sheets into the muck. Pain shot up her ankle, but it was the humiliation that burned hottest. She heard a coarse laugh from one of the hands leaning against the bunkhouse. As she struggled to rise, her hands sinking into the mire, another hand, strong, calloused, and surprisingly gentle, closed around her arm, steadying her. It was Eli. He helped her to her feet, his touch firm and impersonal, lasting only a second. He bent, gathered the soiled linens without a word, and placed them back in her basket before turning and walking away. But in that brief contact, a jolt had passed between them, a current of warmth that had nothing to do with the sun. It was the first time they had touched, and the feeling of his skin against hers lingered long after he was gone. The first real conversation they ever had was born from a storm. It had been brewing all day, the sky turning a bruised, greenish-black, the air growing thick and heavy with a suffocating stillness. Clara was in the main barn, forking fresh hay into the stalls, the familiar, dusty scent, a small comfort in the oppressive silence of her life. The first drops of rain hit the tin roof like scattered pebbles, then grew into a roar as the heavens opened. A flash of lightning lit the dark interior of the barn, followed a heartbeat later by a crack of thunder that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. In the strobing light, she saw that she was not alone. Eli stood near the massive barn doors, staring out at the downpour, his silhouette a dark, unmoving shape against the sheets of gray rain. He must have heard her small gasp, because he turned his head. The shadows were deep in the barn, but she could see the glint of his eyes. Neither of them spoke for a long moment, the only sound the drumming of the rain and the nervous shifting of the horses in their stalls. "It's a bad one," she said finally, her voice barely a whisper, feeling foolish for stating the obvious. He nodded, his gaze returning to the storm. "It'll pass." His voice was low and rough, like stones grinding together, the sound of a man not used to speaking. Silence fell between them again, but this time it felt different. It wasn't the empty, lonely silence of the house. It was a shared space, filled with unspoken things. The air was cool and damp, thick with the smell of rain, wet earth, and horses. "Thank you," Clara said, the words coming out in a rush before she could lose her nerve. For the pump handle, and the other things." He didn't feign ignorance. He simply gave another slow nod. "No need for thanks."
"My husband, he has a temper,"
she offered, not sure why she was confiding in him, only that she felt an overwhelming need to. "I've noticed," he said, his tone flat. He turned from the door to face her more fully, and in the dim light, she could see the troubled lines around his mouth. "You should be careful, Mrs. Horn." "Clara," she corrected him softly. "My name is Clara." He looked away, a muscle tightening in his jaw. "It's not my place to call you that, and it's not your place to be in here alone with me." His words were a warning, a dismissal, but they were not unkind. There was a deep sadness in them, a weariness that went bone deep. She felt a surge of boldness, a desperate need to understand the man who had shown her more kindness in silent gestures than her husband had in all their weeks of marriage. "Why?" she asked. "Why do you help me?" Lightning flashed again, illuminating his face, the pale, jagged scar stark against his skin. For an instant, his expression was unguarded, and she saw a flicker of raw, profound pain in his eyes. "You shouldn't trust me, Clara," he said, his voice barely audible above the storm. "Don't mistake me for a good man. I'm not. I've done terrible things. There's a reason a man like me ends up working for wages on another man's land with nothing to his name." He looked down at his hands, turning them over as if he were seeing them for the first time. "These hands have brought nothing but ruin." The confession hung in the air between them, heavy and fraught with a dark history she couldn't begin to imagine. It was a warning meant to push her away, but it had the opposite effect. It drew her closer, for in his admission of being broken, she felt a profound sense of kinship. They were two damaged souls, taking shelter from a storm that raged both outside and within. The rain began to lessen, and the moment was broken. "You should go back to the house before your husband comes looking for you," he said, his voice once again distant and guarded. He had rebuilt the wall between them, but not before she had seen a glimpse of the man behind it. She nodded and slipped out of the barn, her heart pounding a rhythm that matched the fading thunder. Silas's suspicion, which had been a low, simmering coal, began to burn hotter. He had seen them from the house, two figures shadowed in the doorway of the barn during the storm. He said nothing at first, but his eyes followed her everywhere, cold and calculating. He began to make small, cutting remarks, dropping poison into the silence of their evenings. "Saw you talking with that drifter, Eli," he said one night at dinner, casually sharpening a knife against a honing stone. "A wife should be careful of the company she keeps, especially with men of his kind. A man with no past is a man with no honor." His accusations grew more direct, more venomous. He would question where she had been if she was out of his sight for more than a few minutes. He would inspect her clothes, her hands, looking for some sign of what, she didn't know. He was a man consumed by the idea of ownership, and the thought that some part of her thoughts, her feelings, her loyalty, might not belong entirely to him was an intolerable affront. His cruelty, once cold and methodical, now had a heated, jealous edge. The final confrontation came on a moonless night, the air still damp and heavy from the day's storm. He had been drinking whiskey, and his eyes had a dangerous, feverish glint. He followed her into their bedroom and closed the door behind him, the click of the latch echoing like a gunshot in the silent house. "You think I don't see it?" he hissed, advancing on her. "The way you look at him, the way you make excuses to be near him. You think I'm a fool?" "I don't know what you're talking about," Clara whispered, backing away until her legs hit the edge of the bed. "Liar!" he roared, and his hand shot out, grabbing a handful of her hair, yanking her head back. Pain, sharp and blinding, exploded in her scalp. "You're my wife. You belong to me, your body, your thoughts, everything. I bought and paid for you, and you will not shame me in my own house." He shoved her, and she fell backward onto the bed, her head hitting the wooden headboard with a sickening thud. The room spun, stars bursting behind her eyes. He stood over her, his face contorted in a mask of cold rage. He wasn't shouting anymore. His voice was a low, terrifying whisper. "I will teach you what it means to be obedient. I will scrub that drifter from your mind." His hand came up, and she flinched, but it wasn't a fist. He backhanded her across the face, the force of the blow snapping her head to the side, the sharp sting of his ring cutting her lip. The metallic taste of blood filled her mouth. In that moment, something inside Clara broke. The numbness, the resignation, the silent endurance, it was all shattered by a wave of pure, primal terror. This was not just cruelty. This was a prelude to annihilation. She saw in his eyes not just anger, but a chilling intent to break her completely, to erase whatever was left of her spirit. As he reached for her again, her survival instinct took over. She scrambled off the far side of the bed, her movements clumsy and desperate. He lunged, but she was faster, driven by a fear so profound it gave her wings. She threw open the bedroom door and ran. She fled through the dark, silent house, his footsteps pounding on the wooden floors behind her. She didn't think. She just ran, out the back door and into the black, rain-soaked night. The mud sucked at her bare feet, cold and slick. Sobs tore from her throat, raw and ragged. She ran blindly, not toward the road, not toward the town, but toward the dark expanse of the plains, her only thought to put as much distance as possible between herself and the monster in the house. She stumbled and fell, her cheek scraping against the wet, gritty earth. Blood from her cut lip mingled with the dirt and her tears. She was bleeding, terrified, and utterly alone. She made it to the fence line that marked the edge of the property before her legs gave out. She collapsed against a wooden post, her body shaking uncontrollably from cold and shock. The world was a blur of darkness and pain. She was covered in mud, shivering, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "This is how it ends," she thought. "I'll die out here in the dirt." A sound cut through the darkness, the soft thud of footsteps. Her head snapped up, her heart seizing with terror. It was him. Silas had found her. But the figure that emerged from the shadows was not her husband. It was Eli. He stopped a few feet away, his face a pale oval in the gloom. He didn't speak, just took in the sight of her, the torn nightdress, the mud, the blood on her face. His own face was a mask of something she couldn't read, but his eyes, even in the darkness, burned with a fierce, terrible light. He moved toward her slowly, as if approaching a frightened animal. He knelt in the mud beside her and gently, so gently, brushed a stray, wet strand of hair from her face. "He hurt you," he said. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact, spoken in a voice thick with a rage that was all the more terrifying for how quiet it was. Clara could only nod, a fresh wave of sobs shaking her. He shrugged off his coat and wrapped it around her shivering shoulders. It smelled of leather and rain and him. "Come on," he said softly, helping her to her feet. "You can't stay here." He led her away from the ranch, his arm a steady presence around her, guiding her through the darkness. They walked for what felt like miles until they reached a small, dilapidated structure nestled in a grove of cottonwoods, an old line cabin, long abandoned. Inside, it was dark and smelled of dust and decay, but it was dry. It was safe. Eli settled her on a dusty old cot and, with a flint and steel from his pocket, managed to start a small, sputtering fire in the stone fireplace. The flickering light cast dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls. He found an old tin bucket, filled it from a rain barrel outside, and tore a strip from the hem of his own shirt. He came and knelt before her, gently dabbing at the cut on her lip. his touch infinitely careful. As she sat there, wrapped in his coat, watching the firelight play over his scarred, serious face, the last of her composure crumbled. "I can't go back," she whispered, the words raw and broken. "I can't. He'll kill me next time. I'd rather die out here, free, than live another day as his property." Eli finished cleaning the cut and drew back, his expression tight with a familiar, agonizing guilt. He stared into the fire, his own demons swirling in the flames. "There was a woman once," he began, his voice raspy and low, as if the words were being torn from him. "During the war, things were bad. I was young and angry at the whole world. I drank too much. We argued. I raised my hand to her." He paused, swallowing hard, the memory of fresh and open wound. "I didn't think. I just did it. The look in her eyes after. I saw what I was. A monster, just like the ones I'd been fighting." He looked at Clara, his own pain a stark mirror to hers. "I swore to God that day I'd never touch another woman, not in anger, not in comfort, not in any way at all. I thought if I kept my hands to myself, I couldn't cause any more harm." His confession laid him bare, exposing a shame as deep and as searing as her own. In that small, forgotten cabin, surrounded by the vast, dark wilderness, they were no longer a rancher's wife and a hired hand. They were two broken souls, stripped of everything but their pain, and in that share-haired, desolate space, where all their guilt and sorrow lay exposed in the flickering firelight, something new and fragile began to grow. It was not hope, not yet, but it was a connection, a bond forged in the crucible of their suffering. In the place where shame had lived, love was beginning to take root. Dawn broke gray and unforgiving, the light filtering into the derelict cabin to reveal a world of dust motes dancing in the gloom. Clara had not slept. She had sat by the dying embers of the fire, wrapped in Eli's coat, replaying the night's terror and the quiet confession that had followed. The warmth of the coat was a strange comfort, a small island of safety in a vast ocean of fear. But she knew it was a borrowed safety, a temporary shelter that could not last. The rising sun was a summons back to a reality she could not outrun. Eli was outside, a silent silhouette against the pale morning sky. He had given her the cabin, sleeping somewhere out in the open with only his saddle for a pillow. When she emerged, he turned, his face etched with a weary concern. The question was in his eyes, unspoken but clear. What now? "I have to go back," she said, her voice a dry rasp. The words tasted like ash in her mouth, but she knew they were true. A shadow crossed his face. "Clara, you can't, after what he did." "And do what?" she countered, her own voice sharper than she intended. "Run. To where? Every town has a man like Silas. Every town has whispers and judgments. I have no money, no family to take me in. Running is just a slower way of dying. At least there. I know the monster I am facing." It was a grim logic, born of absolute desperation, but it was the only logic she had left. To run was to become a ghost, a fugitive with no name and no place. To stay was to face a battle, but at least it was a battle on known ground. He said nothing for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the distant ranch house, a dark smudge on the horizon. He understood her reasoning better than she knew. He had been running his whole life, and he knew it solved nothing. It only changed the scenery around the same old pain. "I can't stop you," he said finally, his voice low, "but I won't let you walk back there alone." "You can't come with me," she insisted. "If he sees us together, he will—" She didn't need to finish the sentence. They both knew what Silas would do. "He won't see me," Eli promised. And so she began the long walk back. The earth was still damp, cool beneath her bare feet. With every step toward the ranch, the dread grew, coiling in her stomach like a cold snake. But there was something else, too, a tiny, hard kernel of resolve she hadn't possessed before. She had survived the night. She had been seen, truly seen by another human being. It was not much, but it was enough to keep her from shattering. As she walked, she did not look back, but she could feel him. He was a presence at her back, a shadow moving through the tall grass and behind the sparse cover of the mesquite trees, a silent guardian keeping a hopeless watch. When she arrived, Silas was on the porch, a cup of coffee in his hand. He watched her approach, his face a mask of cold fury. He did not ask where she had been. He did not mention the events of the night. He simply looked at the dirt on her nightdress, the dried blood on her lip, and the coat she still clutched around her shoulders. It was not Eli's coat. She had left that in the cabin. But it was a symbol of her flight.
"It is Sunday,"
he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "Go and make yourself presentable. We are going to church." It was not a request. It was a command, and she understood its purpose immediately. This was not about piety. It was about performance. The church was small and suffocatingly warm, filled with the scent of dry pine, old hymnals, and the townspeople's Sunday best. Every head turned as Silas led her down the aisle, his hand a vice on her upper arm. He did not guide her to a pew. Instead, he stopped at the very front, before the altar and the stern-faced preacher. The whispers started instantly, a rustle of judgment that spread through the congregation like a prairie fire. Silas turned to face the crowd, his expression one of sober, righteous grievance.
"My friends,"
he began, his voice ringing with a false sincerity that made Clara's skin crawl. "My wife has been troubled. The temptations of this world are great, and her spirit is weak. She has brought shame upon my household and upon herself." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle into the shocked silence. "She has asked for an opportunity to repent, to kneel before God and this congregation and ask for forgiveness for her wayward thoughts." He looked down at her then, his eyes 2 chips of ice.
"Kneel,"
he commanded, his voice a low hiss for her ears alone. Her body refused. Every muscle screamed in protest. To kneel here now was to accept his narrative, to publicly declare herself the sinner he painted her to be. It was to validate his cruelty and erase his violence. But the faces staring back at her were not friendly. She saw the pious satisfaction on the face of the preacher's wife, the open scorn of the blacksmith's son, the nervous pity of a few women who knew better but dared not speak. She was alone. To refuse would only lead to a greater, more brutal punishment back at the ranch. Slowly, her legs trembling, she sank to her knees on the rough, splintery floorboards. Her head was bowed, her hair falling to hide her face, but she felt the heat of 100 eyes on her, stripping her bare, branding her with their judgment. The shame was a physical thing, a crushing weight on her shoulders, a fire in her cheeks. The preacher, a man named Reverend Miller, seized the opportunity. He placed a hand on Silas's shoulder, a gesture of solidarity. "Brother Horn, your Christian charity does you credit. It is a hard path to guide a straying lamb back to the flock." He then turned his gaze upon the town, his voice rising in a self-important boom. His sermon that morning was on the wages of sin, on the wickedness of the flesh, and the holy necessity of punishment. He spoke of Jezebel and Delilah, of women as vessels of temptation, of the sacred duty of a husband to rule his household with a firm hand. Every word was a lash against Clara's soul. He spoke of punishment not as a cruelty, but as a form of divine love, a way to cleanse the sinner's soul with pain. Clara knelt there, the hard wood digging into her knees, and felt herself splitting in two. One part of her, the part that had been raised to fear God and respect her elders, absorbed the preacher's words and burned with a sickening self-loathing. Was she wicked? Was this all her fault? Had she invited Silas's rage with her silent thoughts of another man? But another part of her, a new and unfamiliar part that had been born in the terror of the previous night, listened with a cold, rising fury. This was not justice. This was not God. This was the tyranny of men, dressed up in holy robes and sanctified with scripture. A silent rebellion began to stir in the ashes of her humiliation, a dangerous, defiant spark that refused to be extinguished. Outside, hidden in the shadows at the side of the church, Eli watched through a grimy window pane. He saw it all. He saw Silas's righteous posture. He saw the faces of the crowd. And he saw Clara, a small, broken figure on her knees. He saw her tremble, and he felt a rage so pure and so absolute it threatened to consume him. His hands, resting on the worn brim of his hat, were shaking, the knuckles white. He wanted to storm in there, to tear Silas apart with his bare hands, to burn that whole hypocritical assembly to the ground. But he was nothing, a drifter, a hired hand with a dark past. To interfere would be to sign his own death warrant and, worse, to condemn Clara to an even more terrible fate. He was utterly, agonizingly powerless. All he could do was watch, his own guilt and self-hatred a bitter poison in his throat. He had warned her he was not a good man. A good man, a real man, would have done something. He just stood there, hidden in the shadows, shaking. Later that afternoon, the inevitable confrontation happened. Silas found Eli by the corral, checking the hoof of a lame horse. Silas didn't waste time with pleasantries. He walked right up to him, his shadow falling over Eli like a shroud. "You're finished here," Silas said, his voice dangerously calm. "Get your things and get off my land." Eli straightened up slowly, his movements deliberate. He did not look surprised. "I have a week's wages coming to me." "You have nothing coming to you," Silas sneered. "Consider yourself lucky I don't take a horsewhip to you for poisoning my wife's mind. I see how you look at her. I see how she looks at you. You think you can come onto my property and taint what is mine?" "Your wife is a decent woman," Eli said, his voice low and even, a stark contrast to the venom in Silas's. "Maybe if you treated her like one, you wouldn't have to worry about her mind." It was the wrong thing to say. Silas's face contorted with rage, and he lunged, his big fist connecting with Eli's jaw. The sound was a sickening crack. Eli staggered back, tasting blood. He was wiry and fast, but Silas was bigger, heavier, a man hardened by years of physical dominance over man and beast. Eli got in a few quick jabs, but Silas absorbed them like a bull taking bee stings. He closed the distance, grabbing Eli by the shirt and slamming him against the hard wooden rails of the corral. The air rushed from Eli's lungs. Silas hit him again, a brutal blow to the stomach that doubled him over. He followed it with another to the side of his head. Clara saw it from the kitchen window. She screamed, dropping the dish she was holding, and ran outside. "Stop it! Silas, stop!" Her voice only seemed to fuel his fury. He threw Eli to the ground and kicked him hard in the ribs. "This is what happens to vermin that sneak into my house," he roared. Two of the other ranch hands appeared, drawn by the commotion, but they made no move to intervene. They simply watched, their faces grim. This was the master's business. Silas hauled Eli to his feet, his face bloody, his breathing ragged. He shoved him toward the main gate. "I ever see your face on my land again, I'll kill you. Do you understand me?" He then turned his blazing eyes on Clara, who stood frozen with horror by the porch. "And you," he said, his voice dropping to a terrifying whisper as he pointed a trembling finger at Eli's battered form. "Next time, he won't get off so easy. Next time, I'll kill your savior right in front of you, so you can watch." He spat in the dirt, turned his back on them both, and stalked into the house. Eli stumbled away, not even bothering to collect his meager belongings from the bunkhouse. He did not look back at Clara. He simply walked away, a beaten man cast out into the wilderness. That night, the house was filled with a silence that was louder and more terrifying than any shouting. Clara lay in her bed, every muscle tense, listening to the sound of Silas's heavy, rhythmic breathing from the other side of the mattress. She waited. She waited for hours, until the moon was high in the sky, and she was certain he was deep in a whiskey-fueled sleep. Then, moving with the silence of a wraith, she slipped out of the bed. She didn't bother with shoes or a shawl. Barefoot, clad only in her thin cotton nightdress, she crept from the house. The ground was cold and sharp against the soles of her feet, small stones and twigs pressing into her skin, but she barely felt it. She was guided by a desperate, instinctual need, a pull as powerful and undeniable as the tide. She had to find him. She had to know if he was all right. She followed the faint ribbon of the river, its gentle murmuring the only sound in the vast, silent darkness. She found his camp a mile downstream, a small, solitary fire burning near the water's edge. He was sitting with his back against a fallen log, staring into the flames. His face was a mess of bruises and cuts in the firelight, his shirt torn. He heard her approach and was on his feet in an instant, his hand instinctively going to the pistol at his hip. When he saw it was her, the tension left his body, replaced by a deep, weary sorrow.
"Clara, you should not be here,"
he said, his voice hoarse.
"I had to see,"
she whispered, stopping a few feet from him.
He hurt you badly."
"It's nothing," he lied, turning his face away so she wouldn't see the full extent of the damage. "I've had worse." She took another step closer, her bare feet sinking into the soft, damp earth by the riverbank. "No, it is not nothing. He did that because of me." "He did that because he's a bully and a coward," Eli countered, his voice rough with anger. "It has nothing to do with you."
"It has everything to do with me,"
she cried, the words tearing from her, raw and full of a pain that went far beyond the day's events. "Don't you see? Everything is a lie. The church, the town, my marriage. It is all a performance. They want me to be quiet and good and gentle. They want me to kneel and pretend that punishment is a kindness." She looked at him then, her eyes shining with unshed tears in the firelight. "I am tired of gentleness, Eli. It's just another word for a beautiful lie." She closed the small distance between them, her courage a wild, desperate thing. "I don't want you to be gentle with me. I don't want you to protect me with pretty words. I want the truth. Even if it hurts, I want something real." He stood frozen, his own pain and guilt warring with the raw need he saw in her eyes. He was a broken man, a violent man, a man who had sworn never to touch a woman again for fear of the damage he could do. But she wasn't asking for a savior. She was asking for a fellow sinner. She was asking for a truth as broken and scarred as his own. Slowly, as if it were the hardest thing he had ever done, he raised his hands. He did not touch her face or her arms. He gently took her hands in his. They were cold, and he wrapped his larger, warmer ones around them. It was not enough. With a small, choked sob, Clara stepped forward, into the space she was forbidden to enter, and pressed herself against his chest, burying her face in the rough fabric of his shirt. For a moment, he remained rigid, his body a statue of conflict. Then, with a shuddering breath that seemed to carry the weight of all his past sins, his arms came around her, holding her tightly. It was not a lover's embrace. Not yet. It was the desperate, clinging hold of two people drowning, finding a single, solid piece of wreckage in a storm-tossed sea. Her small, trembling frame was held against his bruised and aching body. She could feel the unsteady beat of his heart against her cheek. They stood there for a long time under the vast, star-dusted canopy of the night sky, the murmuring river a witness to their silent communion, the cool, damp dirt beneath her feet, the infinite stars above, the living water beside them. These were the only truths left. Their love, if that is what it was not born in a church or a civilized home. It was born right here, in the dirt and the darkness, a raw, defiant, and terrifyingly real thing. The embrace by the river was a secret kept by the night, but secrets in a small town have a way of seeping into the daylight like a persistent stain. Clara's return to the ranch the morning after Eli's beating was a silent affair, but the story was already being written for her by others. The ranch hands, who had witnessed the fight, talked. The man who sold Silas his whiskey talked. Soon, the entire town was talking. The whispers that had followed her down the church aisle on her wedding day now became a cacophony of open condemnation. When she went into town for supplies, the women who had once offered her looks of pity now turned their backs. Conversations would cease when she entered the general store, the silence thick with accusation. They called her a fallen woman, a Jezebel who had tempted a drifter and brought shame upon her husband. They did not see the fading bruise on her cheek or the haunted look in her eyes. They saw only the story Silas had carefully constructed, that of a virtuous, long-suffering husband and his ungrateful, sinful wife. She was no longer a victim to be pitied, but a threat to the town's fragile moral order, a living embodiment of female weakness and deceit. The isolation she had felt in her husband's house now extended to the entire world. She was an island, and the sea of judgment was rising around her. Silas, for his part, wore his humiliation like a martyr's robe. He reveled in the role of the wronged husband, accepting the solemn nods and sympathetic handshakes of the other men in town. But beneath the performance, his pride festered. He had beaten Eli, cast him out, and publicly shamed his wife. Yet it was not enough. The mere existence of Eli was an intolerable insult, a reminder that something of his wife's had escaped his ownership. He needed more than just exile. He needed utter ruin. He found his solution in the town's sheriff, a man named Brody, whose commitment to justice was far less steadfast than his commitment to self-interest. One afternoon, Silas met him at the saloon, the two men speaking in low tones over a bottle of rye. Silas placed a heavy leather pouch on the table between them. "A horse went missing from my north pasture 2 nights ago," Silas said, his voice a low rumble. "A fine bay mare. I have reason to believe it was that drifter, Eli, who was working for me, the one I ran off my land." Sheriff Brody, a portly man with a perpetually bored expression, eyed the pouch. "You have proof of that?" "I have my certainty," Silas replied, pushing the pouch an inch closer. "And I have this, a contribution to ensure the law is upheld with appropriate diligence." Brody's fingers closed around the leather. He didn't need to count the coins to know it was more than a month's salary. "Certainty is often enough in cases like this," the sheriff said, his voice smooth as oil. "A horse thief is the lowest kind of vermin. We'll find him." They found Eli camped by the river a day later. It wasn't an arrest. It was an ambush. Brody and his 2 deputies descended on his camp at dusk. Eli, caught off guard, barely had time to stand before they were on him. They didn't bother with questions. They beat him with a savagery that had nothing to do with the law and everything to do with the pouch of coins sitting in the sheriff's desk drawer. They broke 2 of his ribs and split his eyebrow open before dragging him back to town and throwing him into the small, squalid jail cell behind the sheriff's office. News of the horse thief's capture spread almost as fast as the gossip about Clara. It was a satisfying, righteous story for the townspeople. The villain had been caught, the good man's property was avenged, and order was restored. Clara heard the news from one of the ranch hands, who spoke of it with a grim satisfaction. The world tilted beneath her feet. She knew, with a certainty that was cold and absolute, that it was a lie. Eli was many things, a wanderer, a man haunted by his past, but he was not a thief. This was Silas's work. This was his final, cruel stroke of revenge. For 2 days, she was a prisoner of her own terror and indecision. Then, under the cover of a moonless night, she did the one thing she knew she had to do. She slipped out of the house, a small bundle of bread, cheese, and a flask of clean water clutched in her hand. She crept through the sleeping town, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. The sheriff's office was dark. A single lantern cast a weak, yellow glow from inside, illuminating the barred window of the cell at the back of the building. She moved into the deep shadows of the alleyway, her breath held tight in her chest. "Eli?" she whispered, her voice a fragile thread in the darkness. A shape stirred in the gloom of the cell, He moved toward the bars, his steps slow and pained. When his face came into the weak lamplight, a gasp escaped her. It was a swollen, bruised mask. The cut over his eye was crusted with dried blood, and his lip was split anew. He looked less like a man and more like a ghost of one.
Clara,
He rasped, his voice thick with pain. You have to go. If anyone sees you here.
I brought you something,
She said, ignoring his warning, her hands trembling as she pushed the small bundle through the bars.
It's not much.
He looked at the food, then back at her, his gaze filled with a profound, aching sadness. You shouldn't have come. Tears welled in her eyes, hot and stinging. She reached through the bars, her fingers hesitating for a moment before gently touching the bruised and swollen skin of his cheek. He flinched at the contact but didn't pull away. He closed his eyes, leaning into her touch as if it were the only warmth left in the world.
I know you didn't do it,
She whispered fiercely.
I know Silas did this.
It doesn't matter what you know, he said, his voice rough with despair. It's his word against mine, a rich rancher against a drifter. The story's already been written.
I'll tell them,
She said, her desperation making her bold.
I'll tell the sheriff the truth. I'll tell everyone what Silas is, what he's done.
His eyes snapped open, and he grabbed her hand, his grip surprisingly strong. No, he said, his voice urgent, pleading. You will do nothing. Do you hear me, Clara? You will say nothing. He's already ruined your name. Don't let him ruin the rest of you. Your life, it will be over. You'll be an outcast with nothing and nowhere to go. I'm not worth that.
What am I supposed to do?
She sobbed, her tears finally falling, tracing paths through the dust on her cheeks.
Just let them hang you.
My life was over a long time ago, he said, his voice softening, his thumb gently stroking the back of her hand. Just go back to the house. Be the wife he wants you to be. Be quiet. Be safe. Please, Clara. For me. Don't let him win by destroying you, too. His words, meant to protect her, were the cruelest blow of all. He was asking her to save herself by surrendering, to survive by letting the last spark of her spirit die. She stood there, her hand held in his through the cold iron bars, and a terrible clarity washed over her. Eli was right. The story had already been written. Justice was not a blindfolded woman holding a set of scales. It was a man like Silas Horn, holding a pouch of coins. It was a sheriff who knew the price of a lie and a town that preferred a comfortable fiction to an ugly truth. The law, the church, society itself, they were all just fences on a rich man's land, built to keep him safe and his property contained. She pulled her hand away and stepped back into the darkness, leaving the bundle of food on the ground. She turned and walked away without another word, Eli's desperate plea echoing in her ears. But she could not do what he asked. She could not go back and be quiet. The part of her that knew how to be obedient, the part that could endure in silence, had been killed. All that was left was a cold, hard fury. Her last hope, her last appeal to the world of men and their rules, lay with the church. The next afternoon, she went to see Reverend Miller. She found him in his study, a small, airless room that smelled of old paper and self-satisfaction. He looked up from his Bible, his expression one of mild annoyance at the interruption. "Mrs. Horn," he said, his voice cool. "To what do I owe this unexpected visit?"
Reverend,
she began, her own voice shaking despite her resolve.
I have come to
confess. A flicker of pious interest lit his eyes. He leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "The Lord's ear is always open to a repentant heart. My child, speak."
This is not a confession of my sin,
she said, her voice gaining strength.
It is a confession of my suffering. My husband, he is a cruel man. He has been from the beginning. He hurts me. Reverend, the things he did to me, the night I ran from the house.
She faltered, the words catching in her throat.
the shame of it still too raw to speak aloud. And Eli, the man in your jail, he is innocent. My husband framed him to punish me, to protect his own pride. This is not justice. It is a lie.
She laid the truth before him, the whole ugly, brutal story, her words tumbling out in a torrent of pain and desperation. She confessed not her own supposed wickedness, but the wickedness that had been done to her. When she finished, she stood before him, breathless and trembling, awaiting his verdict, praying for a crumb of compassion, of help, of validation. Reverend Miller listened without interruption, his expression unreadable. When she was done, a long, heavy silence filled the room. He looked at her not with sympathy, but with a cool, clinical disapproval. "A wife's lot is not always an easy one," he began, his voice condescending, patronizing. "The scriptures tell us that a woman must be submissive to her husband, that she must honor him and obey him in all things. Mr. Horn is a good Christian man, a pillar of this community. Perhaps his methods of discipline are firm, but it is his right and his duty to correct a wife who has strayed in her heart and shamed him before the community."
"But he lied,"
she insisted, her voice rising in disbelief.
"An innocent man is going to hang because of his lie."
"The drifter is a man of no account, a sinner by his own reputation," the preacher said dismissively. "His fate is in God's hands. Your fate, Mrs. Horn, is to return to your husband, to kneel and ask his forgiveness, to bear your punishment, whatever it may be, with a humble and silent spirit. That is the path to righteousness. That is what a good wife does." He stood, a clear dismissal. The interview was over. Clara stared at him, at his placid, untroubled face, and she finally understood. There was no help here. There was no sanctuary. The church was just another wall in her prison, its bars forged from scripture and sanctimony. The fury that had been simmering inside her erupted into a cold, clear flame. She had been a fool to expect anything else. She had begged for justice from the men who had built a world without it. She turned and walked out of the study without another word, leaving the preacher to his Bible and his comfortable lies. She did not go back to the main house. Her steps, now steady and sure, carried her across the yard to the barn. The air inside was warm and thick with the familiar smell of hay and animals. It was here she had first spoken to Eli. Here she had felt the first flicker of a human connection in her desolate life. Now, it would be the place where something ended. She walked to the small, cluttered tack room where Silas kept his tools and his gun. It was a Colt Peacemaker, heavy and black, hanging in a worn leather holster from a nail on the wall. It was his ultimate symbol of power and control, the tool he used to enforce his will upon his world. She took it down. The metal was cold and heavy in her hands. It felt alien, but also strangely final. She checked the cylinder. It was fully loaded, with the gun held down at her side, hidden in the folds of her skirt. She waited. Silas found her there an hour later. He strode into the barn, his face dark with irritation.
"What are you doing skulking in here? I want my dinner."
She did not answer. She simply stood in the middle of the barn floor, watching him. He saw the look on her face then, the unnatural stillness, the cold fire in her eyes, and he paused. "What is the matter with you, girl?" he demanded, a flicker of unease in his voice.
"Eli is innocent,"
she said, her own voice a stranger to her ears, flat and empty of all emotion.
"You have to go to the sheriff and tell him the truth. You have to let him go."
Silas stared at her for a second, and then he laughed. It was a short, ugly, barking sound. "You are in no position to be making demands. That drifter will hang, and you will learn your place. I should have taken a whip to you the day I married you. It would have saved us all this trouble." He started toward her, his hand raised, his face twisting into the familiar mask of rage she knew so well. Now you will learn what true punishment feels like." As he lunged for her, she raised the gun. The sight of it stopped him cold. He stood 5 feet away, his expression a mixture of shock and disbelief, which quickly curdled back into contemptuous rage. "Put that down, you foolish girl. You don't have the nerve."
"Let him go, Silas,"
she repeated, her voice as cold and steady as the gun in her hand. "Never," he snarled, and he took a step toward her. "I will see him swing from the gallows, and I will make you watch. Now give me the gun before I break your arm." He lunged, his big hand reaching not for the gun, but for her wrist, intending to wrench it from her grasp. Her finger was on the trigger, and her instinct was to pull away, to resist. They grappled, his brute strength against her desperate resistance. He twisted her arm, pain shooting up to her shoulder. The world became a blur of his snarling face, the smell of sweat and whiskey, the rough texture of his shirt. Her body was being bent backward. The gun caught between them. And then there was a sound, a deafening explosion that ripped through the quiet of the barn. It was louder than thunder, a violent, final roar that seemed to suck all the air from the space. The force of the struggle ceased. Silas's grip on her wrist went slack. He stumbled back a step, a look of profound, stupid surprise on his face. A dark, blossoming stain appeared on the front of his shirt, high on his chest. He looked down at it, then back up at her, his mouth opening as if to say something, but no words came out, only a soft, wet gurgle. His eyes, the color of faded denim, went wide and then vacant. He crumpled to the ground, his fall heavy and final, like a felled tree. His blood, dark and shockingly red, began to pool in the dirt and hay around him. The barn was suddenly, unnervingly silent, save for the panicked stamping of a horse in its stall. The heavy gun slipped from Clara's numb fingers, thudding into the dirt beside her. The air was thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder. She stood over his body, her chest heaving, her mind a complete and utter blank. She stared down at the still form of the man who had been her husband, her owner, her tormentor. And then, through the shock, a single, terrifying thought broke through. I am free. The realization was not one of triumph or joy. It was a cold, stark, and horrifying truth that settled in the pit of her stomach. Freedom had come, but it had come at the end of a gun barrel, delivered in a shroud of tragedy and blood. The storm that broke over the plains that night was biblical. It was not the cleansing, life-giving rain the land so desperately needed, but a violent, furious assault of wind and water. Thunder cracked the sky open, and lightning illuminated the world in stark, terrifying flashes of white. For Eli, locked in the suffocating darkness of his cell, the storm was a kind of prayer answered. The tin roof of the sheriff's office rattled and groaned under the deluge, the sound so deafening it was a physical blow. Sheriff Brody, more interested in a bottle of whiskey and a game of solitaire than his prisoner, had retired to the front room, leaving the back of the building to the mercy of the elements. Eli had been testing the lock for hours, a loose piece of wire he'd pulled from his cot, his only tool. It was a cheap, rust-pitted thing, and under the cover of a particularly violent clap of thunder, he felt the mechanism give. He waited, his heart pounding against his bruised ribs, but no one came. The storm was his accomplice. He slipped out of the cell and into the back alley, the cold rain a shocking, welcome baptism on his battered face. He was free, but freedom meant nothing without her. His only thought was Clara. He had to get her away from Silas before the rancher's rage, stoked by the escape of his prisoner, turned truly murderous. Unaware of the tragedy that had already unfolded, he began the long, treacherous journey back to the ranch, moving through the storm like a ghost driven by a single, desperate purpose. He found the main house dark and silent, an unnerving stillness that set his teeth on edge. A primal instinct, a feeling of profound wrongness, drew him not to the house, but to the barn. The massive doors were slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness leaking out into the rain-swept night. He pushed one open, the hinges groaning in protest, and stepped inside. The air was still and close, thick with the smell of hay, animals, and something else, the sharp, metallic tang of fresh blood and the acrid scent of spent gunpowder. A single lantern sat on the floor, its flame sputtering, casting long, grotesque shadows that danced and writhed on the walls, and in the center of its weak, flickering light, he saw her. Clara was on her knees in the dirt, her body trembling uncontrollably. Her nightdress was torn and smeared with mud and a terrifying amount of blood. She was staring at something on the ground in front of her, her expression one of utter, vacant shock. It was Silas. He lay on his back, his eyes wide and staring at the rafters, a dark, congealing pool spreading out from the hole in his chest. The cult peacemaker lay in the dirt a few feet away. Eli's mind reeled, the reality of the scene before him too monstrous to immediately comprehend. He had imagined a dozen scenarios on his way here, finding her beaten, finding her locked away, but never this. "Clara," he whispered, his voice a raw croak. Her head snapped up, her eyes wide with a terror that seemed to see right through him. She didn't seem to recognize him at first. She was lost, adrift in the horror of what she had done. He took a step closer, and she flinched, scrambling backward through the bloody mud like a cornered animal.
"I didn't mean to,"
she whispered, the words a broken, rattling sound in her throat. It was a child's plea, a desperate, hopeless denial.
"He was going to. I just wanted him to stop. I didn't mean to."
He crossed the remaining distance and knelt in front of her, ignoring the body of the man who had tormented them both. He reached out, his hands hovering for a moment before he gently took her by the shoulders. She was as cold as ice, her trembling so violent he could feel it vibrating through his own body.
"Clara, look at me,"
he said, his voice low and steady, trying to anchor her to the present moment.
"It's me. It's Eli."
Her eyes slowly focused on his face, and a glimmer of recognition flickered in their depths. The dam of her shock broke, and a terrible, silent sob racked her body. She collapsed against him, her face buried in his chest, her hands clutching at his wet shirt. He held her, surrounded by the evidence of her desperate act, and knew in that instant that his life, and hers, had been irrevocably altered. There was no going back. There was no law, no justice, no town that would ever see this as anything other than murder. They were fugitives now. "We have to go," he said, his voice grim. "We have to go right now." But as he looked from her catatonic form to Silas's body, he knew they couldn't just leave him here. His discovery in the morning would send a posse after them before they had a 10-mile lead. A grim resolve settled over him. "We have to bury him," he said, the words feeling like stones in his mouth. The work was a nightmare. The storm raged on as they took 2 shovels from the tack room and went to a small, secluded copse of trees behind the barn. The ground was a sucking mire of mud and clay, and for every shovelful of earth they removed, another seemed to wash back in with the rain. They worked in a terrible, shared silence, their movements frantic and desperate. Clara seemed to be moving in a trance, her face a pale, expressionless mask, her eyes fixed on the deepening hole in the ground. It was a grave for her husband, but it felt like the grave for the life she had once known, for the girl she had once been. They wrapped Silas's body in an old horse blanket and carried him, a grim, heavy burden, to the makeshift grave. They laid him in the wet earth, and as Eli began to push the mud back into the hole, Clara finally broke, sinking to her knees, her hands covering her face as a wave of dry, hacking sobs shook her. Eli finished the gruesome task alone, packing the earth down, scattering wet leaves and broken branches over the spot to make it look as undisturbed as possible. It was a poor effort, but it was all they had. Before the first hint of dawn could betray them, they fled. Eli packed a single saddlebag with what little he could find: a loaf of bread, a canteen of water, a box of cartridges for the colt, which he now wore at his hip. He saddled the two strongest horses, and he lifted Clara, who was moving as if in a dream, onto one of them. They rode out not on the main road, but heading straight into the vast, open wilderness of the plains, the storm at their backs, the darkness swallowing them whole. Their journey became a blur of exhaustion and fear. They rode until the horses were lathered and trembling, then walked to spare them, then rode again. The world around them was a vast, unforgiving canvas that mirrored the desolation in their own hearts. The wind-swept plains offered no shelter, no place to hide, their emptiness a constant reminder of how alone and exposed they were. The sun, when it finally burned through the clouds, was a merciless eye in the sky, punishing them with its heat, baking the earth into a cracked and barren wasteland. They lived on the edge of starvation, their few supplies dwindling with terrifying speed. Eli taught Clara how to set snares for rabbits, and they drank from muddy streams, the water gritty and warm. Every distant cloud of dust was a potential posse, every crack of a twig the sound of their discovery. Guilt was their constant companion. For Clara, it was the recurring image of Silas's face, his eyes wide with surprise as the life left him. For Eli, it was the deeper, more insidious guilt of a man who believed he was a curse. He had come into her life, and now she was a fugitive, a killer. He had brought her nothing but ruin, just as he had feared. Yet, in the midst of the punishment, there were fleeting moments of something that felt almost like salvation. They would stop by a cold, clear river to water the horses, and for a few minutes, the cool water on their faces would wash away the grime and the fear. They would watch a sunset that set the entire sky on fire with colors so beautiful they ached. A brief, breathtaking reminder that there was still beauty in a world that had become so ugly. In those moments, they would talk, not of what had happened, but of small things, the names of stars, the feel of the cool night air. They would share a piece of hard bread, and the simple act of providing for one another became a sacrament. They were not just two fugitives running from the law. They were two human beings clinging to each other in the vast, indifferent wilderness. After weeks of aimless, desperate flight, they stumbled upon it, an abandoned mining town, tucked away in a high, secluded canyon. It was a ghost town in the truest sense. A collection of ramshackle buildings with gaping windows and doors that groaned on rusted hinges in the wind. The silence was absolute, the only sound the mournful whistling of the wind through the decaying structures. It was a place where lives had been lived and lost, where dreams had been chased and had turned to dust. It was the perfect place for two people who no longer existed. They made their home in what had once been the assayer's office, a small, sturdy building with a stone fireplace and a roof that mostly held. They lived like the ghosts that haunted the town, surviving on what they could find. They discovered a root cellar behind the old general store with a few forgotten jars of peaches and beans. Eli managed to shoot a deer, and they smoked the meat, the unfamiliar taste of a full meal a shocking luxury. They were utterly alone, cut off from the world, and in that isolation, a strange and fragile peace began to settle. Clara began to change. The vacant, traumatized look in her eyes was slowly replaced by a quiet strength. She learned the rhythms of their new life, how to track, how to read the sky for weather, how to make a fire that gave off little smoke. The physical hardship seemed to burn away the last vestiges of the helpless girl she had been. One afternoon, as they were trying to fix a broken chair, Eli hit his thumb with a rock they were using as a hammer. He let out a string of curses, hopping on one foot, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. Clara laughed. It was a small, rusty sound at first, as if the mechanism for it had forgotten how to work. But then it grew, a genuine, bubbling sound of pure amusement. The sound was so startlingly beautiful in the dead silence of the town that Eli stopped nursing his thumb and just stared at her. A slow, gentle smile spreading across his own face. But the healing was only on the surface. At night, the nightmares came. She would wake up shivering and slick with sweat. The image of Silas's face, his blood on her hands, as vivid as if it had just happened. The ghost of her husband was a more persistent hunter than any posse. As Clara slowly began to find her strength, Eli seemed to wrestle more deeply with his own guilt. He watched her newfound resilience not with joy, but with a kind of sorrowful distance. In his mind, every laugh she managed, every bit of strength she gained, was just a prelude to a greater fall. He was cursed. He was the common denominator in every tragedy he had ever touched. He had tried to stay away from her, to keep his ruinous nature from tainting her, but he had failed. He had not only failed to protect her, he had led her down a path that ended in blood and exile. He became more withdrawn, the silence stretching between them for hours at a time, his own self-loathing a palpable presence in their small cabin. One night, the tension between them, a volatile mixture of shared trauma, unspoken desire, and suffocating guilt, finally reached its breaking point. A cold autumn wind howled through the ghost town, rattling the loose boards of their shelter. They sat on opposite sides of the fire, the silence between them heavier than ever. Clara could not bear it anymore.
"Talk to me, Eli,"
she pleaded softly.
"Please, do not shut me out."
He wouldn't look at her, his gaze fixed on the hypnotic dance of the flames. "There's nothing to say."
"There is everything to say,"
she insisted, her voice rising with a desperate edge.
"We are here, together. That has to mean something. It cannot all be for nothing."
He finally looked at her then, and his eyes were full of such profound self-hatred that it took her breath away. "It means I've destroyed you. Clara, that's what it means. I should have kept writing that first day I saw you. I should never have spoken to you. Everything I touch turns to ash. I brought this down on you. His death. It's as much on my hands as it is on yours."
"No,"
she whispered, shaking her head.
"That is not true. I made a choice. For the first time in my life, I made a choice."
"You call this a choice?" he asked, his voice a low, bitter rasp. "Living like rats in a dead town, looking over our shoulders for the rest of our lives? This is not a life. Clara, it's a punishment." The word hung in the air between them. Punishment. It was the word the preacher had used. It was the word Silas had promised. It was the word that had lived in the deepest, most secret part of her own heart ever since she had pulled the trigger. She felt a profound and terrible sense of sin, of being stained beyond all repair. But tangled up with that sin was the undeniable, terrifying truth that she had never felt more alive than she did here, with him. The guilt and the desire were one and the same, an unbearable, beautiful ache. She stood up and crossed the small room, kneeling in front of him in the flickering firelight. She looked into his tormented eyes, wanting him to see the truth in hers. She was ruined. Yes, she was a sinner, but she was his. In a moment of raw, desperate honesty, where all her shame and all her desire finally collided, she gave voice to the deepest, most conflicted truth of her soul. She reached out and placed a trembling hand on his cheek. "Punish me if you must," she whispered, her voice thick with tears and a need so profound it was almost a prayer. "I deserve to like it." The words were a shocking confession, an offering of her own brokenness. It was not a plea for pain, but a plea for a truth that was as raw and as real as the blood they had spilled. It was an acknowledgement of their shared damnation, and a defiant claim to the love that had been born from it. Eli stared at her, his own heart breaking. He saw not a sinner asking for retribution, but a survivor begging for release. He saw the woman he loved, offering him the only thing she had left to give, her own beautiful, shattered self. He leaned forward, and his lips met hers. It was not a gentle kiss. It was a kiss of desperation, of hunger, of two lost souls clinging to each other in the dark. It was a reckoning and a release, an act of both punishment and salvation.
in the heart of a ghost town, surrounded by the ghosts of their past. Their love became a fierce, defiant flame against the encroaching darkness, a claim to a life the world had tried to deny them. Their fragile peace in the ghost town lasted through the turn of the season, a stolen autumn of quiet days and cold, star-filled nights. But the world they had fled had not forgotten them. Back at the Horn Ranch, Silas's absence had at first been a relief to the hands, then a curiosity, and finally, a cause for alarm. A search of the property revealed the disturbed earth behind the barn. The discovery of Silas's decomposing body, wrapped in a horse blanket, sent a shockwave of horror and righteous fury through the county. Sheriff Brody, his authority now bolstered by a genuine murder, formed a posse. He was no longer just a lawman on the take. He was the avenging hand of a civilized society, tasked with hunting down the fallen woman and the murderous drifter who had led her astray. They found the trail easily enough. 2 horses, heading not toward any town, but deep into the unforgiving wilderness. A tracker, a quiet man who could read a broken twig like a page in a book, led them on a slow, methodical pursuit that spanned weeks. The end came on a cold, gray morning. Eli was returning from checking his snares when he saw them, a line of riders silhouetted against the ridge overlooking the canyon, their forms stark and menacing. There was no time to run, no place to hide. The ghost town, their sanctuary, had become a tomb. He burst back into the assayer's office, his face pale and grim. "They're here," he said, the words a death knell in the quiet room. Clara's blood went cold. She looked at him, at the Colt peacemaker now in his hand, and saw not fear in his eyes, but a terrible, final resolve. He was not thinking of escape. He was thinking of her. "Get to the back," he commanded, his voice low and urgent. "There's a loose board behind the fireplace. Get in the crawl space and do not make a sound, no matter what you hear." "No," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "I will not hide while you—" "You will," he cut her off, his hands gripping her shoulders, his gaze burning into hers. "I've brought you nothing but ruin. Clara, I won't let the last thing I do be leading them to you. Live! Do you hear me? You live!" He kissed her then, a hard, desperate kiss that tasted of fear and goodbye. Before she could protest further, he pushed her toward the fireplace and turned to face the door, a lone, broken man preparing to face down the judgment of the world. The posse rode into the town's only street, their horses nervous, their rifles at the ready. Sheriff Brody dismounted, using a horse for cover. "Eli, we know you're in there. We have you surrounded. Come out with your hands empty." The only answer was the sudden, sharp crack of the Colt firing from the office window. A deputy cried out, clutching his arm where the bullet had grazed him. The air exploded into a chaotic volley of gunfire. Bullets tore through the thin wooden walls of the office, splintering wood, shattering the last grimy panes of glass. Huddled in the darkness of the crawl space, Clara covered her ears, her body shaking with each gunshot. Every shot from the Colt was a beat of Eli's heart. Every answering volley was the sound of her world being torn apart. She could hear him moving, firing from the window, then from a hole in the wall, trying to make his single gun sound like more. The fight was desperate, brutal, and short. Eli knew he couldn't win. He was only buying time, though for what? He wasn't sure. He caught a glimpse of Brody moving to flank the building, circling around toward the back where Clara was hidden. A cold dread seized him. He fired 2 quick shots to drive the other men back, then abandoned the front window, turning to block the sheriff's path. As he moved across the room, a rifle blast from the street tore through the wall. The bullet caught him high in the side, a fiery sledgehammer blow that threw him against the stone fireplace. He gasped, a sharp, wet sound, and slid to the floor, the Colt clattering from his numb fingers. The sudden silence was more terrifying than the noise. Clara, hearing the thud of his body, could not obey his command. A sound, half sob, half scream,
escaped her lips, and she scrambled out from behind the loose board. She saw him slumped at the base of the fireplace, his face pale as ash, a dark stain spreading rapidly across his shirt. Eli! His name was still on her lips when Sheriff Brody kicked the door in. His pistol leveled. His eyes went from Eli's fallen form to Clara, her face a mask of horror. He saw her not as a threat, but as the prize. "It's over," he said, a grim satisfaction in his voice. But it wasn't. Eli, with a last, monumental effort, pushed himself up. His vision was blurring, his sight a universe of pure agony. But he saw the sheriff's gun pointed at Clara. He lunged, not for his own weapon, but for Brody's legs, tackling him in a desperate, final act of protection. The sheriff stumbled, his pistol firing harmlessly into the ceiling as they both went down. The other deputies, seeing their leader attacked, opened fire. 2 more bullets struck Eli's back. His body went limp. "Hold your fire!" Brody roared, scrambling to his feet, his face livid. But it was too late. Clara moved then, a creature of pure, primal instinct. She threw herself over Eli's body, shielding him with her own, as if she could somehow absorb the bullets that had already struck. She grabbed him under the arms and began to drag him, her feet slipping in his blood on the dusty floorboards. She dragged him out the back door, away from the men, away from their guns, her only thought to get him away, to save him. It had begun to rain again, a cold, miserable drizzle that turned the dirt of the ghost town into a slick, greasy mud. She dragged him through it, her breath coming in ragged, tearing sobs. He was a dead weight, his life pouring out of him into the earth. But she did not stop. She would not leave him. He was fading, his breathing shallow, his eyes struggling to focus on her face. "Clara," he rasped, his voice barely a whisper. "You have to run." "No," she sobbed, her tears mixing with the rain and the mud on her face. "I am not leaving you. I will not leave you." She dragged him onward, toward the river, the place where their story had truly begun. Her strength was failing, her muscles screaming, the mud sucking at her feet. She finally collapsed beside the riverbank, pulling his head and shoulders into her lap. The posse followed at a walk, their urgency gone, their work done. They stood in a half circle, rifles held loosely, watching the final, pathetic act of the tragedy. Sheriff Brody walked forward, his pistol still in his hand, his face hard and unreadable. He stood over them, the rain dripping from the brim of his hat. He raised the gun, intending to end it, to put a final, clean period on this whole messy affair. He looked down at Clara, expecting to see a killer, a sinner, a fallen woman. But what he saw stopped him. He saw a girl, her face streaked with mud and blood and tears, her eyes looking up at him not with fear or hate, but with a gaze so stripped of artifice, so full of raw, profound truth, that it was like looking into the heart of human suffering itself. In her eyes, he saw not sin, but the whole terrible story, the loveless marriage, the casual cruelty, the desperation, the flicker of hope, and the all-consuming love for the dying man in her arms. For the first time, he saw a human being, not a headline. His hand, holding the pistol, trembled slightly. He hesitated. In that moment of hesitation, Eli's breathing hitched. He looked up at Clara, his eyes clearing for a final, lucid second. He lifted a weak hand, his fingers brushing her cheek, smearing it with his own blood. "You're so beautiful," he whispered, and then, with a soft, final sigh, his eyes went vacant. He was gone. Clara held him, rocking him gently, a low, animal sound of pure grief rising from her throat. The rain fell, washing the blood from his face, mingling with her tears. She sat there by the river where they had first found peace, and held him as he died, the world and the men around her fading into an insignificant gray blur. They took her back to town. She did not fight, did not speak. She walked with a strange, unbroken dignity that unnerved the men who held her captive. The town was ready to hang her, to see the final act of justice performed. But the story Sheriff Brody told was different. He spoke of the shootout, of Eli's violent resistance. But when he spoke of Clara, he faltered. He said she never held a weapon, that she had only tried to protect the man she loved, with Eli dead. The town's bloodlust seemed to lose its focus. There was no trial, there was no hanging. Perhaps Brody, in his one moment of conflicting humanity, used the weight of his office to steer the outcome, or perhaps the town, having seen the depths of Silas's cruelty in private for years, was quietly content to let the whole ugly story be buried with the bodies of both men. Her punishment was of a different kind. She was released, but she was not free. She was condemned to live among them, a constant, silent reminder of the darkness that lay beneath the surface of their pious lives. Months passed. The seasons turned. Clara found work as a laundress, living in a small shack on the very edge of town, where the respectable houses gave way to the open plains. Her life became a quiet rhythm of steam, lye soap, and the endless folding of other people's clothes. She was silent and solitary. The townspeople whispered when she walked by. Averting their eyes, they saw the fallen woman, the drifter's lover, the woman who had brought murder into their midst. They saw her hands, raw and chapped from the harsh soap, and they said she would never wash the blood from them. She was a ghost in her own life, haunting the fringes of the community that had cast her out. But something in her spirit remained unbroken. She had loved and been loved. She had fought and she had survived. One evening, as the sun was setting, casting long purple shadows across the plains, she walked out of her shack and down to the riverbank. It was the same river that flowed past the ghost town, the same river where she had held Eli as he died. The light was golden, the air was still, and the water murmured its ancient, constant song. She knelt at the water's edge, the damp earth cool beneath her knees. The town, her shack, her life of lonely toil, it all faded away. There was only the river and the memory. She looked down at her hands, at the skin that was forever marked by lie and labor and the dirt of the past. She whispered his name into the evening air, a soft, private sound that was carried away on the breeze. Eli. Then, slowly, deliberately, she dipped her hands into the cool, clear water. She watched as the current swirled around her fingers, washing over her skin. She was not trying to wash away the stain of what she had done, or the memory of his blood. She was letting the river take what it would, a quiet act of release, of acceptance. It was her own private forgiveness, a peace she had to find for herself, because the world would never grant it to her. A breeze stirred, picking up dust from the dry plains and carrying the faint, clean smell of distant rain. It was a hint, a promise, that even in a world of dust and tragedy, even after the fire has consumed everything, some things endure. Love, in its own defiant and broken way, could outlast shame. Thank you for listening to our story. Comment where you are listening from so we can connect. Subscribe to the From Wild West channel, and share your thoughts with us in English.